Now, some people have asked, I had someone tell me once, what is it you do during the week? You know, and that's a fair question. They said, you should start a social media account where you just show things that happened this week. Nick, did you get that picture I sent you? I forgot to ask him if he got it, so he may not have gotten it if he did. There he is. So I wanted to show you this picture. So we had one of our former senior homeless people, senior as in age, not by rank, but she called and she said, a friend of mine, who's this man sitting in the van, he just got this power wheelchair from Medicare, but he can't get it into his car. And she said, do you think the church could help with a ramp? So we went on Amazon.com and we bought a ramp. And this is the Extended Stay Hotel by Boeing. Some of you that are old engineers, it used to be a hotel for professional people, and now it's really become a hotel. You know, the hotels became essentially temporary housing in many places, because it was the only place you could have temporary housing without all of the political wrangling about homelessness and so on. So it turns out that the ramp fits in the door, but the wheelchair doesn't fit in the van. But then this woman, who's also in a wheelchair, she came around, and she said, what are you doing? We said, well, we're putting a ramp to see if we can fit this wheelchair in. And she goes, oh, she says, I could help too. And she goes, but I don't have any legs. And I said, well, it looks like you have legs. And she said, I got a MRSA infection in my toe. And it went into my leg, and I lost one leg. Then I got septic, and I lost my other leg. And so she goes, I have below the knee 2 fake legs. And so anyhow, this guy in the van, the lady who was part of our senior homeless group, all of them have been housed but one, she said he would have been part of our group, but he's a special political class. He's a refugee from Iran. I said, from Iran? Yeah, he has asylum. I said, well, when did that happen? 1987. So he's been on this temporary status for almost 40 years in the United States. Anyhow, in case you wonder what's happening during the week, this is what's happening. It turned out it was a failure because that handle behind his head, you can't fit the wheelchair through anyhow. And I said, see, the problem is this has to work when no one else is here. Like, I'm helping you now, but if you can't do it by yourself, then it's not going to work. So we'll see if we can work it out. We may or may not. But the lady in the other wheelchair goes, can I have your number? She said, I have a few things I need done too. So. Nick, you can take that picture down. I do hope that you'll pay attention, especially as we get into March, because we have a lot of cool stuff coming up. One is, we have our Shrove Tuesday, youth pancake dinner before Ash Wednesday. And then the second Sunday in March, we're only going to have one service. Michelle had started Second Sunday, which is almost like what we used to do during COVID out in the courtyard, and it's a little more laid back. It's all of church, but in a more interactive way. So we're going to do that the second Sunday in March. We're actually going to do that service in the morning. And then the third Sunday in March, we're going to have a special meeting to talk about the parsonage and doing some of the necessary legislative stuff to get ready for that. And so just pay attention in March. We have a lot of things happening in March. And then right after that meeting, we'll be going to Japan and working with our partners in Japan. Now, as I mentioned with the choir song, Give Me Jesus, actually I want to say one other thing before I get into the sermon. If you listen to our first hymn and you listen to the prayer of the day, both of those came from St. Francis of Assisi. The language, hopefully you recognize that language. And when I decided to become a pastor, because I didn't want to be a pastor, that you need to know that, because I was young, I had other ambitions, But I was in Assisi. And I had read a book about St. Francis of Assisi, and there's a little chapel called San Damiano. That's our son has the name Damien. And that was the church where St. Francis was told, build my church. And he thought it was to rebuild this ruined chapel, but it was to rebuild the whole church in a time of great chaos. And then there's a mountain called Mount Subasio where he had a vision, so I went up to the mountain. I was praying at the chapel, hoping Jesus would talk to me. He didn't, not in the chapel. But I went up to the mountain, and they have these statues of these Franciscan friars lying in the grass. And I went up on the mountain, and this butterfly came and landed on the lips of the Franciscan. And I had this little inkling of a call to preach. It was like, oh, I want you to preach, like a butterfly on the lips. And I said, oh, I don't want to do that. Well, here I am, and that's the... But it's just important hearing those words. These things matter, when we have these influences. Who are the voices that influenced you? What are the stories that shaped you to bring you to this place? And it would be later that summer that I finally had an experience with God that made me say yes to this calling. But the reason I want to bring this up is the way of Jesus is not an easy way, and you heard that in the gospel this morning. Jesus said several times, look, everyone's already living in a kind of moral economy where if people are your friends, you treat them well. If they're not your friends, you don't treat them well. And Jesus is saying to the people that are listening to him, if you're just going to live like everybody else, what difference does it make that you're my follower? People are already nice to the people who are nice to them. People already punish the people who are their enemies. And you'll notice that the message of grace, which is the message hopefully that we have preached, probably with differing degrees of success over the years, the message of grace is a one-way gift from God. God came to us, God loved us, God shared this gift. And the thing you need to understand is the way of the Christian is also one direction. It's unidirectional, it's only one place. And it's heading in the same direction of grace and mercy, and it goes against what we might describe as our animal nature, which includes a propensity toward revenge and violence. Now, there are some pretty incredible revenge stories that you can hear about and discover. Like, I'll tell you one that I've told the Bible study before from World War II. It was actually after World War II. His name was Elihu Iskowitz, if anyone knows that name. Anyone a fan of Elihu Iskowitz? He was Romanian. He was a young boy, and his parents and family, as maybe one or two brothers, were killed by the Nazis. But as you know, the only way the Nazis were successful in their mass killing was having local people participate. Because they just didn't have the manpower to do what they did without the help of local people. And this kid knew the guy who helped kill his family. His name was Stănescu. And he made a promise, I am going to make sure that I get my revenge. And I will do it. I will spend the rest of my life getting revenge. So after World War II ended, he was looking for Stănescu and couldn't find him, but he found his son, and he murdered his son. And he was a teenager. And he got arrested. He went to juvenile hall. He got out. And that did not sate his desire for revenge. He ended up going to Israel. He joined the Israeli Defense Force. And he was still looking for this guy, putting out feelers, asking questions, and he found out, like many people after World War II, people in the SS and other war criminals and other people, they joined the French Foreign Legion. And so he found out that Stănescu had joined the French Foreign Legion. So he transferred to the Israeli Navy, and he went to Italy, and he deserted, because he wanted to go join the French Foreign Legion to find this guy. So he leaves in Italy, goes to France, joins the French Foreign Legion, gets sent to Algeria to be trained, and he finds out that Stănescu ends up in French Indochina, which is pre-Vietnam. They were the people in Vietnam before us. And many of the fighters from World War II who had difficult backgrounds or criminal backgrounds were fighting in Vietnam before we were fighting in Vietnam. So he asks to be transferred to French Indochina. And he ends up getting put in the same unit with the guy who killed his family. And now this is 10 years after, over 10 years after. They go out and they end up in a firefight with the fighters who are allied with Ho Chi Minh at the time. And in the middle of the firefight, after it dies down, he turns to him and he says, "Do you know who I am?" And the guy assumes that it's a friend of his son, because he would have been the same age as his son who got murdered, not knowing that this is the guy that murdered his son. He said, "You killed my family, and now I'm going to kill you." And he took his submachine gun and killed him. And then he went back to the base and he said, "Oh, he died in a firefight." And then he finished his term in the French Foreign Legion. He went to Israel, and he told them, by the way, I deserted. And this is how the story came out, because he went on trial. He ended up in an Israeli prison for a year, and then lived out the rest of his life in Israel. That's a pretty incredible story of revenge. Someone whose life had been marked by trauma and murder, and this guy was driven by, if there's no justice, I will seek justice, and I will do it with the point of a knife and with a gun, even in the jungle. I mean, the guy literally followed this guy from Romania to the jungles of Vietnam to seek his revenge. And I think everyone who's here can understand why he would do that. And yet, when we listen to this reading from the gospel this morning, the way of Jesus says this is not the way he wants us to go. And it's so unsatisfying. And especially in a world where bad things happen and people get away with things they shouldn't get away with, we go, "Really, God? This is how you're going to deal with things?" And the most profound example of someone living out this way of the gospel, before the gospel, is Joseph, and that reading that we had from Genesis. Now, the Joseph story is about a fifth of Genesis, so it's a really important story, which is interesting because Abraham's obviously important. Isaac has just a little bit of the story. Jacob has a little bit more. Joseph has this huge, long story about himself. And I think the reason the story has such prominence in Genesis, it is someone who is living out this way of Jesus before Jesus announces the way of Jesus. Because when he makes the announcement that he did, when Alice, there she is, she moved over from here to here. when Alice read that moment and it said, and then Joseph stood up and said, I am Joseph. Where is my father? Or how is my father doing? And it doesn't say, and his brother said, oh my gosh, I knew it was you. I could recognize that voice anywhere. The brothers don't talk until the very end of the reading today because they are absolutely shocked and terrified that he's still alive. With the same shock of being in a jungle in Vietnam and finding out that the person whose family you killed 10 years earlier has tracked you down and found you and is now going to seek revenge, the brothers are sitting there looking at their brother who is literally operating all the levers of power in Egypt. Egypt is the most powerful country in the world at this time, at least the world that they knew. He says, even the Pharaoh of Egypt views me as a father, says Joseph. So when he stands up to his brothers and says, I am Joseph, you can imagine they're like, yeah, I can't say it in church, but you can imagine what they were thinking. Because in the same way they had visited violence, deceit, and lies on Joseph to almost kill him, to sell him into slavery, to convince their father that he'd been murdered. I mean, imagine when Jacob gets the message, Joseph said, you should come to Egypt. He thought Joseph was dead because the sons had lied and said he'd been killed by wild animals. And this story is so powerful because it has the ultimate justification for revenge. Joseph suffered innocently. He was at the hands of sinful men. He has all the levers of power where he could do it without any kind of recourse. He wouldn't have even gone to jail in an Israeli prison for a year. And he doesn't. Because he recognizes that the evil that was done to him is something that God has taken captive and used for good. God is not the author of evil. God does not visit evil on people. This is the whole point of redemption. If God visited evil on people, we would have a very strange religion. And in fact, there are some people in church who think we do have a strange religion because deep down they think God is visiting evil on us in different ways. God is taking the evil that people engage in, the short-sighted violence, and God is folding it into this direction of grace, which is, I want to move toward life, toward redemption, toward fullness. You'll notice in the reading of the gospel this morning, Jesus' words are uncompromising. There is no way to soften them unless we soften them by 1,000 cuts. Jesus doesn't say, if anyone asks you for anything, evaluate their moral character or evaluate your monthly budget and see if it's possible for you to make this expense without it interrupting your cash flow. He says, if they ask for you, give it. If they take it from you, don't ask for it back. And he says, love your enemies. And the love word that he uses there is the same word that God loves us with, the agape word. So he doesn't even just say, just do your best. Just give them a taste to show them that you're a religious person. He says, treat your enemies like God, meaning God loves enemies. You need to understand that this isn't just God making a choice. Well, I'd rather burn you. I'd rather zap you into a pile of ashes, but I've decided not to. This is God's nature. God's nature is mercy. God's nature is love. And so when he says, love your enemies, he's saying, love people like God loved you. Because you'll remember in St. Paul, Paul tells us very clearly, while we were still far off, while we were still God's enemies, God did not wait for us to come around. God did this work of salvation and redemption before we were even ready, before we even knew it was already enacted and done. And so you think of someone like Joseph. Joseph has already decided not to seek revenge on his brothers. His revenge is to restore them, is to have them sit in the shame of what they've done and to see what they did. His revenge is to cry over them and all the things they missed and all the days of being in prison. Because if you remember, Joseph's story is pretty bad. So almost murdered, sold into slavery, falsely accused of sexual assault, falsely imprisoned. The guy's biography, it's a pretty wild story. And he has every reason to be angry and to grind that axe. But that anger and that axe grinding will distort his nature. And that violence will distort his nature. And it will finally not satisfy the longing he has for a true and restorative justice. And this is the thing that Jesus is calling us to. If you're going to follow in the way of Jesus, these uncompromising words in the gospel are really hard to hear. Because we'd love to find a middle way, going, well, love your enemies until they give you a reason not to. Give to people until you say, you know what, I've done enough, I'm done now. What does it mean to live with an openness that is sort of a unidirectional existence? Meaning, I want to move in the same direction as God. God is moving toward grace. God is moving toward redemption. Even more specifically, God is moving toward resurrection. This is why Give Me Jesus as a choir anthem is so important, and why it's so important that we had 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul is still talking about resurrection. If you want an anchor of the Bible, or a chapter of the Bible to be an anchor, 1 Corinthians 15 is a great anchor, because it's all about resurrection. And resurrection is the primary message of this movement, saying, why on earth would I love my enemies? Why on earth would I give to people who ask of me and not ask for people who take from me? What a stupid way to live. Unless this is the way to resurrection. This is the way to newness of life. This is the way out of the cycles of escalating revenge and violence that tear down communities, tear down trust, and become multi-generational feuds. You think of like the Hatfields and the McCoys or someone like that in American history. Multi-generational people dedicated toward eradicating their enemies. And it is not a way to build any kind of community. It is not a way to build any kind of future. What does Joseph tell them? God took what you did. What you intended for evil, God intended for good. And by your evil, God is going to save you. Because now there's going to be 5 more years. You guys thought this thing was almost over. It's just beginning. There's going to be 5 more years of a famine, and you're going to be fed the fruit of what you did that was evil. Now that seems to be counterintuitive, because we say, well, bad trees can't only bear bad fruit. They can't bear good fruit. Except the gift of God's grace and the gift of redemption includes the cross. The ultimate example of what God has done to redeem is to take the poison tree that only has poison fruit, which is death, and to bring about the fruit of salvation. So God says, I will take your anger, I will take your violence, I will take your murder, I will take your deceit, I will take your injustice, I will take all of your wickedness and all of your misguided hate, and I will use it to save you. This is the message of the cross. This is the power of this way of life, which is living in the direction of grace, mercy, hope, peace, and so on. And we hear Paul say that. Paul says, if this is what God does with our evil, imagine what God can do with goodness. God has shown us his great power. And this is the genius of Christianity, but also the scandal of Christianity, that God has taken these things and used them to accomplish our salvation. And so Jesus' ethical teaching, because there's only a few places where Jesus gives us the ethical program of Christianity, and this sermon is one of them. If the power of resurrection is at work, we will begin to see us living not just by a choice, but by our nature, to live by love, to live by embrace of our neighbor, to live by love of our enemies, and to see what God does with this gift. Amen.